Good morning. I'm Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're at the bottom of page 1338. Aleph Shin Lamed Ches. Explaining the process of how the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim were drawn down and revealed by God to Moshe Rabbeinu, and in turn given to us, which essentially is the power of Yom Kippur, of forgiveness. So in the actual story, we know it followed the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, and that was what caused Moshe to go back on the mountain to ask for forgiveness and finally receive the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. So it was a way to forgive for the sins. As we're learning, and we will learn, the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim are not just for sinners, because they are a revelation of divine compassion, period. Yes, it was evoked as a result of a sin, but it itself preceded sins. The idea of Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim was not created after the Chet HaEgel. It was revealed then. God revealed that, as Rashi explains, and we read the verses, he revealed the Seder Atfili. Here's the way to evoke. I will show you the secret, the method, that when you'll need it, here's how you can reach to me, into my depths, to be able to invoke forgiveness, even in times of difficult times, as we learned. So in the language of the Maimer, of the Chassidus of it, the Alter Rebbe's language in the Maimorim, which he said in Tovkuf Samach Beis, I said 1801. And the Rebbe Rashab is basing this whole section on those Maimorim, including the beer of the Tzemach Tzedek on those Maimorim, or the beer from the Tzemach Tzedek, a beer that was said on that Maimon Tzemach Tzedek brings in his Sfarim, as I've been indicating. So what's the point? The language of Chassidus is that this is reaching into the Tzur. The Tzur is the rock that Moshe stood on, and the crevice within the rock is the Gevuros of Atik, which is the root of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim as they flow through Moiches Tima, the strands of hair that come from the super consciousness rooted in Gevuros of Atik, or Butzina de Kardenissa, which is from the Rishimu, as he made it very clear. So all this is the language in Chassidus and Kabbalah to describe the place where this is rooted. So you see it's rooted in a state of Helam, not in a state of Gili. A Tzur, like a flintstone, it's not like a coal, where you see fire or the fire is concealed, but it's accessible. In a Tzur, it's when the fire does, as Alter Rebbe actually says the language, that at Tzaddik, the fire in the soul is burning. But in a Baal Tshuva, when after he sinned, before he does Tshuva, the fire has so-called been extinguished, meaning from expression. So he has to access only one place, the Tzur. You have to go and strike the rock in order to access the root of all the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim, or the root of all the energies of the divine. So it's dafka someone that does not have a revelation. So he has to access what we call the Helam, or even higher, the Koyach HaNelam, Helam HaAtzmi. All this is indicating the level of the rock and the crevice within the rock that Moshe was placed, and from where originates the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. That's a summation what we learned until the last paragraph that we went over yesterday in the last two classes. So Nikra Satsur, just want to see if I missed anything. Okay, so placing Moshe, and there's the clay Reikon, it's a state of bittul, of empty, an empty container in order to draw down from that level. Or what he called Yesod Malchus of Ein Sof, connected to Yesod the Nukva, Yesod of Bin. Okay. But now, what's the Baver Kvedi? What is that referring to? That when my COVID will pass, Baver Kvedi, that's V'samticha, that's when I will place you in this crevice within the rock, the cavity within the rock. So here, we began discussing yesterday. I'm going to sum it up again now, because, as I said, I'm developing it myself as I learn it, but I think the picture is something like this. First of all, what is COVID? Kavod is the glory of the honor of the king. And we learned it's one thing with Malchus. That's why a melech, like you said, Malchus ikar in namlucha kavod kved melech. Kved malchuschi yameru. And that's why a melech cannot forgive someone that has dishonored him. Melech shemochel al kved ein kved mochel. Because it's one and the same with Malchus. Malchus and kavod are because if you think about it, why is there the concept of a king altogether? We're not talking about the destructive kings or kings in Klippa. We're talking in Kedusha. What's the concept of a king? A king invokes sum tasa melech melech, appoint a king, and there's a yiras hamelech. He's meant to bring out yiras shamayim, because when you look at the king, he represents the bittul that he has to God. So it's meant to, it's like when we crown God as king, it's essentially to evoke a sense of awe and bittul, which is essentially honoring God. So if you don't honor the king, the whole purpose of a king has no place. What do you need a king for? The king is meant to be something that is to be honored. Again, this is not human worship. Chassidus explains you're honoring a king because the king represents godliness. And he himself is bottled to God. We're not talking about an arrogant king. Now, the fact is that king has the power because of the honor of the king. Even the kings that were in Israel that were not, they were corrupt kings, they also had power like that. But we're talking about where it originates from in Kedusha. So it's the idea of bittul, and kavod is part of what the king is about. In the context of God, it means that when we honor God, we essentially are drawing down God's malchus and revealing godliness. And as he said, that adds mesif kayach, so again, let's make this clear. We're not talking about atzmus now. We're talking about as God manifests in existence, when we honor God as king through following his orders and listening to his Torah and mitzvahs, we are actually drawing down and increasing in godly energy in existence. And the same, God forbid, is the opposite. They cause a diminishment and they cause a weakness, so to speak, kavyachol, in the divine presence, which we see. When a person desecrates God's name, or when we, through sinas chinam, through baseless hatred, cause the Beis HaMikdash to be destroyed, this also caused shchinta begalusa. It wasn't just that we suffered. God also becomes concealed, and in some ways also suffering. Again, kavyachol, it's not suffering as we understand it, but he's with us, and therefore we have impact. That's what avodah is about. Hashem shows that our avodah has an impact on God. Now the question is, what level? That's not right here. He's talking of obviously in the levels of Malchus and the Midas of Atzilus. He says that very clearly. The Midas of Malchus Atzilus, Geidim Teis V'Seir, or lack of Teis V'Seir. Now earlier, just for the record, in volume 2, in the Maimorim Vayikra and Tav Ayin Hey, he discussed at length in Avedet about Avedet Tzur Higher, where our Avedet how deep does it reach up in heaven? All the way up. And there he explained that it reaches even the highest levels. But I don't want to confuse matters here. It's not really directly relevant, but he did discuss this idea. In other words, our impact through our avodah is not just in Giluyim, in Atzilus, it impacts even higher levels. However, there the impact is very different because there God chose that we should have a connection with him. Here we're talking about actually the Oiris and Mikalim, that when we do a mitzvah, we are strengthening the so-called Evarim de Malka, the king's limbs and the king's parts, organs, because the mitzvahs correspond. Ramach Evarim, Ramach Mitzvah correspond to Ramach Evarim de Malka, like he explains in Tanya. So we strengthen, so to speak, the godly manifestation in the structure of Hishtalshlus, or we weaken it. Okay. So now we understand that there's the element of kavod, of kveidi, meaning God's kavod, is in our hands. Meaning when we honor him, it increases. When we dishonor him, it decreases. So now how does the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachman fit into this? Because remember, the point is, Ba'aver kvedi v'samticha, that my kavod will pass. Say the Alter Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab is going with this approach. Ba'aver kvedi meaning histalkus hamalchus. Because in malchus, there can be a geroyin and it could be a diminishment. And Yud Gimel Midas HaRachman means you're going to a place that's higher than the diminishment. In a sense, when the Jews built the golden calf, they dishonored God. So God was saying, what do you want from me to do? They essentially defied and they betrayed my malchus. They built another god, essentially infidelity. Moshe Rabbeinu, however, was begging to invoke something deeper. So as we're going to explain, the Yud Gimel Tzarachim, in other words, are higher than Kvedi. And that's how he teaches Ba'avur Kvedi, Ba'aver Kvedi. So the simple interpretation means when the Kovid will pass through or pass by. As Rashi says, when I will pass by, so you'll see my glory, as he explains afterwards, my back, not my face, but that whole idea. But the deeper interpretation is when Kovid will be defied, will be in some way dishonored. So there, Ba'aver, as I said in the Tafrei Shlamid, the Reb Marash's Taich Ba'aver, Oiver ala Teira. That means he transgressed against Teira. So the Kovid, in other words, passes by, meaning that the Malchus will be elevated in the Stalik because the Malchus has been affected by the Avera. So you'll reach to Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. And that's where Samticha Benikra Satsur, I'll place you in the crevice in the rock. So when the Kovid is passed, meaning I will place you, I will elevate you higher than the Malchus, than Kovid. I will elevate you all the way to Atik, to Gevuros of Atik, from where I will place you from where there, I'll show you and reveal to you the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. That's the basic interpretation. However, the plot thickens here. Because, as I said before, the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim are not only for forgiveness of sins. In the case here, yes, they are, because they came after the Chet Egel. But let's say Moshe Rabbeinu himself. He did not need Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. He did not sin. He wasn't part of the whole Chet Egel. And in general, tzaddikim, you could say every year Yom Kippur, for the people who need to do tshuva, the people who sinned, Yom Kippur is the salvation. God gave us the secret of how to gain forgiveness by going to Gevuros the Atik, higher than the Kovid that may have been somewhat dishonored. Kovid of Malchus and the Midas and the Malchus, where there was a Geroyim. But above, but people who are tzaddikim. So he's going to address this in the next page, really. Then going to talk about Yud Gimel Sarachim as there's a level of Yud Gimel Sarachim, and there's a level of the Tzur, which is even higher, the source of the Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim. That's what appears to me, the pshat here. Again, I'm not 100% because when I read it, it's not black and white spelled out, but it seems to be that's the Havana. But let's read it inside, maybe it'll get clear. But that's I'm ready to go and say this is the way we understand this topic. Okay, but now comes the question about this Geroyan thing. If there's an actual, God forbid, diminishment in the godly presence, then how could you resolve that issue? So what he's saying now is that the Geroyan is not a Geroyan Amiti. And the reason for that is, and we discussed it yesterday, but I want to go over it again right now. It's not a Geroyan Amiti, it's not a true diminishment, because you're not diminishing God's power. On the contrary, the reason he gets angry, the reason the king gets angry and upset when you dishonor him is because of his power, not because of his insecurity or his weakness. The same power that you reveal when you do his rotzen, so the same thing is when you don't do it, that's what causes the so-called the diminishment. Remember, kas here is not, we're not talking about anger as in rage, we're talking about as in a limited flow. When a person is angry, they detach from you. This detachment, this concealment of the divine, this Geroyan, not a Geroyan Amiti, because it's coming from his very power. Like he said, I'm going to read it inside now. So he says like this. It's going to go over what we learned yesterday, just go over it again. Omnom, it's halfway down the page, 1338. It says, Omnom, the line starts Omnom. However, Ein ze Geroyan Amiti chas v'shalom. That when a person does sins, and we just said it weakens and causes a diminishment or weakness, it's not a true amiti, it's not a true diminishment, chas v'shalom, shahare, and he explains now. Al derech moshel hakas hu hagvuris shebedam. Kas is not coming from a weak place; it's coming because there is intensity. There's power in the fiery blood, in the boiling blood, in the heated blood. V'kol ma sheyesh yesher chayes bedamim sheba'adam yekaisi yesher k'she'ena masi chefz. And the more powerful a person he is, the more energy, the more heated is his blood, so to speak, the more angry he'll get when he doesn't get what he wants, when he doesn't realize his desire. Because kas comes from the boiling blood. Whom you say the Esha Belev comes from the element of fire in the heart. He says in Tanya. Okay, I'm just going to skip the line. There he talks about, because we read it yesterday, I'm just going over. The kol is damim yeser. So therefore, the more blood there is, yieretiche yeser. So in other words, a person that's a hot-blooded person, the more hot-blooded he is, the more angry he'll get. So yes, the result of the anger is a diminishment, because it's not exactly it's not his satisfaction. It's not like you're making him happier. The king is not happier; he's angrier. But the very fact of the anger is coming from his power, because of that powerful place. Then he goes even further, and he says, and indeed, this is the reconciliation of the two elements of Gvura. We learned before that the Gvura has it in two things. One is Gvura Vidin, judgment, severity, limitation, Simtsum, Helam, concealment. Back on page 1334, he said it very clear. Simtsum Shebcheheder Ashpa, because it's now a Heder Ashpa. What's he doing? The king, who's now upset because he was dishonored and not respected, so he's withholding his Ashpa. That's called Simtsum. But where is it coming from? It's coming from his power, not because of his lack of. So that's the pshat. So therefore, like he says afterwards, the animal, the stronger the animal is, the more upset it gets when you provoke it. That again goes back to the whole point that we're talking here. Not the Gevuros being affected from outside, but from within their own root. Because that's what it means. The root of the Gevuros, even the harshest Gevuros, is rooted in Gevuros of Atik and Helam Atzmi all the way. So therefore, that's what it's rooted. It just now has come down to a very dark place, but its very root is coming from a very powerful place. Now, power can go both ways. A so-called, let's put it, a more mediocre person who doesn't have such energy won't be as much besimcha and also won't be that angry. In other words, you can't get him going and satisfy him as much as you could someone who's much more powerful, and you also can't get him as angry. So what do you see from this? That the root of the kas, even though again the kas is not a positive, and it is a gedoyim because bottom line he's withholding his ashpa when he's in that state, but it's coming and it's indicating on his power, not on his weakness. Like a wild animal, aggressive animal, has far more anger, and it's sikha, and sikha literally means murder, but it's killing, but it means to say I don't want to say the word violent. What's the word? It's sikha, amidasar it's sikha, very aggressive. Rage. More than rage. Okay. A component so know the more powerful the animal is, the more kased it's much more than a docile animal, meaning docile cattle, I should say, a behemoth. So that's due to his great chayas, to the intense energy that he has. Canal. Okay, fine. So now we've established that, but now comes what happens after you appease him after this anger. Now that he's been provoked, and now you see so much power that the Rebbe Rashab, as I said, it's hinted to in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, but the Rebbe Rashab spells it out. He says, "Ivim Kain, move on." So from this, it's understood. Shekol Mashi Yeser Kas Behepachritz Harotzen. That the more there is, the more anger there is. More Behepach Harotzen. When you defy his will. In other words, the angrier the king gets, or the angrier that God gets, when you defy his will, it has more energy than when you fulfill his will. That's how he's interpreting it. Even though, as I said, you could interpret also differently. You could say, just as he has this anger energy this way, equal to that is the powerful positive energy that he's mashpia when you do what he wants. But here the Rebbe Rashab is clearly saying that's even stronger. Like he says, when you read the Maimon Alter Rebbe, I just want to repeat, it doesn't necessarily, Pshat is not necessarily like this, even though in one place, as I said, I thought it was a typo, but the Rebbe Rashab is going with that. I want to just read again, just for comparative purposes, the Alter Rebbe's Lashon. When I say Alter Rebbe, he didn't write it himself, but it's in the Hanocha that was written. So he says, just want to read these words. He says like this.
Is this in the beer?
I'm going to read it. I'll read it. It's
But I'm
the
asking
beer,
if that's what
no,
you're
the
reading
beer,
from.
it's not the language I want. No, it's not the beer. Not the one I posted. It's in another version of the beer, of the Derech Mitzvah, as I said. Just 1 second. So here's his language here. He says like this. Umavur b'mashal hanal shadamu hanefesh v'ikar achayis nimtza moving shekol mashi yesher kas behepach harotzen. Exactly the same. First half of the language is exactly like it says here. Shekol mashi yesher kas behepach harotzen yeh b'yesher teis v'sachayis b'kiyam harotzen. Okay, now that I read it, actually, it could be I misunderstood. Now that I'm reading it again, so the more there's anger when you defy his will, when you're going against his will, there'll be more additional energy when you fulfill his will.
Could the question be Gili or not Gili? Only that?
No, I'll tell you what the Rebbe Rashab is adding. The Rebbe Rashab is adding one emphasis that is not explicit here, but it makes total sense. So it's not a contradiction. I'm just saying he's adding that the energy exerted in anger is deeper than the energy exerted in joy, so to speak. And therefore comes the second point that once a person who defied God's will, and then he appeases God or the king, and he regains his trust and he regains his hashpah. So that's what he says. So that makes it even stronger why there's no giroyin, because the original reason for the anger came because of his power. So yes, right now there's the giroyin because it's diminished and he's not letting it flow because there's the anger. But the angrier he is, meaning the more powerful he is, when you defy him, in direct proportion to that will be that when you appease him, will also come that energy back and in a more powerful way. And therefore, ultimately, you're accessing his powerful positive energy. It's just that during this time, when he was dishonored, obviously there's the anger. So I don't want to use this example because it's not fitting to God, but using the example used of an animal, if a very aggressive, powerful animal you provoke will turn against you, then when you're able to harness that animal and it turns for you, it will also be far more powerful than a docile behemoth and a cow or something like that, because it has that power. So the Rebbe Rashab definitely is adding that there's it seems like he's adding, because here he just speaks about that when you reconcile, when you appease him, it will be more powerful. Here he's saying it's actually the lav is stronger than the hain. Okay. So now, when you appease or you what's the word? I said yesterday another word, appease. What's another word for appeasing someone from their anger?
Satisfying? No, you don't mean
No,
that.
I used a different word. Okay. Than it would have been had he not been angry in the first place. In other words, when you come to, let's say, a king and you dishonored him, and as a result, there was anger, and there was, like he said, and his heart became harsh. And afterwards, you find a way to reach into his heart and bring him back, so to speak, by showing him even more honor, obviously. So then your connection with him is even deeper. That's what he's saying. Like we say by a Baal Tshuva, a tzaddik has the divine energy because the divine flow is there, but he doesn't have the distance that brought a closeness that could only come from the distance, basically. The
You mean
Imkay
quell?
says that
To quell his anger?
quell is a good word also, but there's another word I use. Quell is fine as well, to quell the anger. So therefore, it's not a Gedoyin Amiti. And as I said yesterday, I think for both reasons. First of all, even when there was a Gedoyin, it's not coming from weakness, it's coming from his power. But most importantly, why am I saying both points? Because then the Rebbe Rashab should have said, Sha'al Yedezeh. He should have said, it's not a Gedoyin Amiti, because through this, when you appease him, then it comes a Teser, but he says, so there's like two steps here. That when the diminishment is a result of his strength and his force and power, and when he's appeased, there'll be a Teser b'yeser. And that's where we stopped yesterday, and I'm going to continue now. So what do we learn from all of this? That there's a whole process going on here. So essentially, Kvedi was dishonored. The Malchus was dishonored. That's Kved HaMelech. Ein Kvedi Machul. And the Melech cannot forgive his covet because there was absolutely a diminishment, as we'll read in a few minutes more. But what can happen is you can misrase, you can appease the king. You can fix it by asking for forgiveness or finding a way to return, finding a way to regain his trust and his love and his connection. So now he's going to go back to the pasuk. So now we'll understand what means ba'aver kvedi. So he says like this, Ubezeh yuvan. And with this we'll understand the verse here in Kisisa. What does it say? Ba'aver kvedi v'samticha v'nikras hatzur. So he says, and with this we'll understand ba'aver kvedi, that when his covet will be passed by, when his covet will pass. Nimsha gili er shalamayla miyud gimel midis harachim. An oil will be drawn down that's higher than the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. Now you say, 1 second, like I mentioned yesterday, what means higher than Yud Gimel Midas Harachim? How suddenly did we get higher? We're talking about the level of Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. That is higher than the place where the king was angry, the Midas and Malchus. That's where the Gedoyin happens. So please be patient with that. We'll understand it in a few minutes. But he does say it. In other words, there's Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim in a case that preceded any anger. Like I said, God has 13 divine attributes of compassion existed even without a sin. That's part of Eibishter, Havaya, Kel, Racham, V'chanan, and so on. It was revealed after the sin, but it existed. But after he got angry, meaning after the sin of the golden calf that enraged God, so to speak, Kav Yachol, and there was the Gedoyin, at least on a certain level, that evoked when he was appeased and he forgave, came a gili higher than the regular Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. And he's going to explain this briefly, shortly. So just be patient, but that's what he's basically saying. Dehine, and here's explained. The Yud Gimel Sarachimim and Rachimim Pshutim, Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim on their own are Rachimim Pshutim. They're seamless and endless compassion. V'sham nimchakin ha'avenis, and their sins are erased. It's an entity where sins don't matter. Mipnei kemosh la'chayis shebedam kaidem shemiskayis. Because, like in the example that we've been giving, the chayis shebedam, there's a lot of energy in the dam, which is this level, before there was any anger. That's why he gets so angry afterwards, because the energy is there. So what is he saying? That Yud Gimel Midas Harachim is a very powerful state, but it's a state that precedes any diminishment. Nothing happened. Now, the words Nemchokin Avenis does throw me a bit. I'm not sure what he means by that. If nothing happens, so why are you saying Nemchokim? So I'm thinking that it means that it's preemptive. It means Avenis don't matter there. He's going to say this afterwards, but Nimchakim does mean erasing, which seems to indicate that there are Vedas that are being erased. But here it seems like it's Vedas that are not, they didn't happen yet, so to speak. So the Yud Gimel Sarachim is just pure compassion flowing from the king. Like we said, when the person is following the king's guidelines and the king's orders, the king has great joy. But let's read on. I think they'll understand this line as well. Let me just see in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer how this is read. Okay,
Are we having the Alter Rebbe's Maimer here on our WhatsApp?
You have a little echo. What did you add? The Rebbe's Maimer? Which Maimer from the Rebbe?
The Alter Rebbe's Maimer and the Derech Mitzvah Sefel.
What, you have one version of it is posted on the WhatsApp. Yeah. There's a few versions. That's why I'm reading from a different one right now. But more or less, the one that's posted is similar to what I'm looking at as well. It's interesting. He says Nimtokin here, and here he says Nimchokin. One second.
Maybe the difference is between just forgiving and transforming, because we were talking about the transformation of the Zonos to Zachias.
We will learn about this in the next page. We'll learn more about it. I ask you, right now I'm not asking anyone to help me with the pshat, if you don't mind, because because there's a lot more to be said. I'm reading it slowly, but in the next page he's going to make it clearer. It's going to become clearer as we go. I'm just trying to fit it into the words right now. So I do know the pshat here. I'm just trying to fit it into the words. You'll soon see, as I said in my introduction, that there's two levels of Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. That's very clear. I was just wondering what Nimchokim means, but we'll see in the next page. He's going to speak about as well that there's two ways of erasing the sins. One is, like we said, the Chesed does it from the outside, and then the second is that it's done from within. That is going to be the difference. I'm just wondering here right now, since he's saying it's Kedem Sham Miskayis. So basically he's saying that there's a level here that has the power to erase sins, but it's not from within. Okay. So now he continues. Let's continue reading here. The Yud Gimel Midas Harachim, hu shehepach harotzen, ein tefes mokim. That's the level that we're talking about. Like, remember, we learned in the second way of sweetening the Gevuros, he said, what's the power? Chesed is so powerful that there's no such a thing as negative. If you remember when he spoke about Moyer Shabbatera Machziri Lemutav, the luminary in Torah has the power to transform into goodness. Or he spoke about the level of before he's a Moshe B'Teira, he said, just go back there for a moment. So he said there, trying to remember what was the other level that he spoke about. Just a second. Oh, here we are. On the bottom of page 1321. So he said, Eitz HaChaim. Remember the second interpretation, the Zohar says that the branch that Hashem showed Moshe that he's thrust into the water to sweeten the water was Eitz HaChaim. So Eitz HaChaim is higher than Chaim and Movis. It's higher than life and death. So same thing here. Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim is a level. It's just the pure, the blood and energy of the king, in this case of godliness. And therefore, anything that comes in its presence will be erased. It's not teifas mokim. And therefore, through tshuva, you draw down these 13 attributes. And automatically, all the sins are erased. But what happens in a case once the king did get angry, when there was a transgression? Because here he's clearly talking about a tshuva that is a higher, that's a tshuva that he's going to explain that's more like from tzaddikim. So now he says, Aval b'bchinas malchus u'b'bchinas zah. When you talk about the level of Malchus and Zah, remember he said before Midas and Malchus, Haritefes Mokim Maisa Tachten. In Yud Gimel Midas Arachamim, the behavior doesn't matter because it's above it all. He's above the negative and the positive, and therefore anything, if you can access that, it erases all the negatives. But what happens in the case where there was an actual dishonoring of God? And Teifas Mokim Maisa Tachtenim, on that level of Malchus and Zah, there it is Teifas Mokim, not like Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim. It's not like an Atik. We're talking now in the spheres. And there, it does matter behavior. And there it increases, and it, like we said, it causes a gedoyin. And through the sins, and through the sins comes an anger and a rage. And as we learned before, this is with an intense energy, much more than this evokes even more energy flowing from him to anger than even more than before he got angry. So now he says, the idea of tshuva, when you do tshuva, on this level, after the anger, then you draw down this extra energy that has now been caused by the anger. And that's the level of Nikras Atzur, the crevice in the rock of the Gevuros the Atik that come Baver Kvedi, that once you've already the covet has been transgressed, so to speak, or you're elevating or you're going higher up from the covet in Malchus and Zah all the way to Atik, and this is Nikras Atzur. So right now, when you read this, it seems a little confusing. What's going on here? Which Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim are we talking about? First, he says there's a level that precedes any type of anger. And there's a lot of energy there. But there, the energy basically nullifies. and erases all sins. But then there's a level that comes after anger of Yud Gimel Mitzrachim, and that's even more powerful, and that's from Nikras Tzur, from the crevice in the rock, even deeper than the first level. So this we need to read. The next section is going to explain what is going on here. When you read it initially, like I said, it's very confusing. What's he talking about here? Which is Yud Gimel Mitzrachim? That's why it's important to remember that there are two levels as they flow to tzaddikim and as they flow to Bali Tshuva. Or as you could say, they flow to those that were not involved in the Chet Egel like Moshe, or those that came after the Chet Egel, after the anger. So the first one is Koydem Sheniskayis, so there's a lot of energy there. It still comes from a high level. Remember, Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachamim is in Keser. But the Nikras Tzur is apparently even higher than that. That's what he's going to say in the next section. So it's going to be the two levels of sweetening Gvura. One from without, the Chesed is so powerful, or the Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachamim is so powerful that it nullifies the bitterness. Not like the first sweetening, which in a sense neutralizes it because it's just more sweet than there is bitter. Here it overpowers it, it simply transforms it, but it's transforming it from a higher power, like zapping it out. And then there's a level that comes from within, Gvuras B'Sharshav, from the within, that can only happen after there was the anger, which adds even more energy from the Melech. And Ba'aver Kfedi is referring to that higher level. And that's where there's the Nikras Tzur. That's how he seems to be explaining it, and I'm going to read it inside now. That's why I didn't want to stop anything, because it could be a little confusing when you just read it on your own. Yeah. If you look in the mimer that I posted, he more or less says, I'm going to read it inside, he says like this. That will understand ha'hefresh be Yud Gimel Sarachim Shem Rak Rachamim B'Sham Nimtokim Ha'Venus B'Pneim Shem Kemosh La'Chayis Shebedam Koydem Sheniskayis. They're like the example of the Chayis, the vitality in the blood before he got angry. V'Chol Yud Sfiris HaGluyas Ba'Atzilus B'Meichin Dezah Hem Kemoshel Kishiyuchel Sheyovi Adam Shubchinis Burus Demaitzel G'Leklal Kas. So the way it's in the Sfiris and Atzilus, that's when the dam is in a situation where the gvuras can come to a state of anger. That's in the level of malchus, which is called kovid. This is how the divine manifests in relation to existence, and there, defying his will matters. Tefes mokim. And that's why it says God regretted. Right. But the 13 attributes of compassion that are higher than the meichin of Chachma and Bina of Atzilus, ein hepacharatzon and tefes mokum klal, ve'em rak chayes amitim, afal pishem gvuras mepnei shenimshchu b'tzimtzum b'meisel meichin kanal. So even though they're in a state of gvura because they came through the meisel meichin, like the Cyrus, but it's coming from an intensity place. And that's why it's not tefes mokum. Okay. And then he goes on to explain why it's not tefes mokum, because like an adult, that when you say something to an adult, they have meichin de gadlus, they're mature enough that you can't insult them. Whereas a child, you can insult. So essentially the way it manifests in Midas and Malchus is more or less a less mature state. That's why there it matters. That's covered. And then there's a level of Yud Gimel Sarachim where it doesn't matter. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to continue to explain this further. So let's read the next page. I'm on page now 1339. She says that we have to understand. You just said to me that this comes after the anger. Then we reach a level of Nikras Tzur, which is the Helam, the crevice in the rock, the Gevuros of Atik. And Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachamim, you're saying, is before he got angry, meaning like you said, it's like the intense energy, but there's no anger there because it's not teifus mokim. But the Gilgul Misrachim also comes to forgive of sins. Razal say Medrash Rabbah Reish Parsha Yud Beis Al Posuk Vayavar Hashem Al Ponav Shehivir Zamei Mehem. It says Vayavar Hashem Al Ponav, that he passed by on his face. So it says, what does it mean? What did he pass by? Shehivir Zamei Mehem. He removed his anger from upon them. So you see clearly that Yud Gimel Midas Arachim Vayavar is removing the anger. So it's also coming after the anger, after the Avenus, coming to forgive the Avenus. So what do you mean by saying that this is like the Moshel HaChayis, Kedem Shem Iskayis? And it's like not Teifus Mokum there. So here's what he says. Oh, he didn't answer yet. Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, and Rosh Hashanah the Gemara, Amar Le HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kol Zman She'Yisrael Chetin, anytime when Jews will sin, Yasru Lefonai Keseder Hazeh. Behave in this manner, V'ani Meichel Lahem, and I will forgive them. So we see clearly again that the whole Yud Gimel Sarachim is essentially a revelation telling Moshe a method that God is saying whenever there'll be a sin, do follow this method or this order, and I will forgive them. So you see that Yud Gimel Sarachim is coming to forgive. It's not just a gilui, a big, great gilui. It's also coming to forgive. V'yesh leimer, and he's now going to say that hefresh beineim, the difference between nikras hatzur, which comes after the sin, and Yud Gimel Sarachim, which can be even before the sin, he's going to say like this: the hefresh beineim, the Yud Gimel Sarachim urak shemai virponim shalzah. That when you talk about Yud Gimel Sarachim, you're only removing ponim shalzam, the face of anger on the Jews. There, it's a level where the Yud Gimel Misarachim are like a light, like light energy that dispels darkness. And this also, the intention is to transform, not just to dispel. Like we said earlier in the second level of sweetening, the Gevuros, that the Eir from the outside is coming and replacing in the place of darkness is coming the Eir. Like we learned earlier in the Aveda of Tzadikim, in the Ava of Tainugim, that it's so intense, their love out of pleasure to God, that the Eir replaces the darkness. And the same thing is Be'unnat Tshuva, but what type of Tshuva is this? He says, V'yashlem shezeu b'tshuva ma'ava, Rabba, shazdenis nasim kezochias, that this is, we're talking about Tshuva ma'ava, from love, where the transgressions, the deliberate transgressions, become merits, like shezeh efshali is gam b'tzadikim. This is possible also by tzadikim, v'loy b'ched ve'oven mamish. We're not talking about actual sin. Tzadikim also can come to this level. As we're going to learn a little later, that Mashiach brings tzadikim to do tshuva, but this is not a tshuva on a sin. This is on a tshuva of reaching a deeper level of connection to God. In general, he tshuva shemitzad hanefesh alekis shaboy shaykh in tshuva ma'ava. That this is a tshuva that's coming from the divine soul, that is also thirsting for God. And there you could have tshuva from love. And this has the power not just to dispel the darkness, but to transform the darkness. But it's coming from nefesh alikis, from chesed, from Eir. This is Yud Gimel Midas Arachimim, the first level, like as if before there was anger. Because there's no sin. Even though it's coming to forgive, but he's saying it's not an actual sin. It's like the sin of a tzaddik that means chet melosh chesodin. That's how I would explain it. That it just means he's not as perfect as he could be. And the transmission from Tzur, from the rock, that's not just vayavet. That's not just moving away, replacing the darkness with light. But that the very darkness transforms to air. And what is that naveda? This is the tshuva we learned earlier, that's not coming from the divine soul's revelation, but this is coming from min ametzar, from a state of distress, and from the animal soul dafke. It's coming from within the darkness itself. So I'm not going to deny it sounds confusing, but it's very clear that he's talking about two levels of Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim. One is more a level like relate more to tzaddikim, where they also come to elevate and to transform the negative, but there it's not a transformation from within. That's a transformation from without. And then there's the level Yud Gimel Harachim that comes after the anger, where there was a real geroyin, there was a real diminishment due to dishonoring. Like a tzaddik doesn't dishonor God. A tzaddik may not be on the highest level. He works more in midas and malchus and atzilus, and he wants to elevate to kesser. So you need Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim to elevate to the Gevuros of Atik, but there, or to let's say to get Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim, and that is also a form of an elevation, but it's not quite like it is after there was an actual sin of the golden calf. That's why I compared it like differently Moshe and the Jewish people. There was a real giroyin that affected a diminished element, also coming from the power of God, but it was diminished. And then through the tshuva they reach the tzur, that reaches a level that's able to transform it from within. So clearly he's talking about two levels here. Now, there's much more to be said on this, and we're going to learn afterwards. He's going to explain, like he's going to say, you still have to understand, since they both come, he says, why is there such a difference? Since both of them are coming to appease God after the anger, so why is there a difference between these two? So he's going to explain this next. But you see here, it's not 100% clear. Is this coming after anger or it's not coming after anger? First he says it's not. Now he seems to say that something is coming. So I'm thinking that maybe he's talking about the difference how Moshe Rabbeinu speaking to Hashem about the level of Moshe and how he's speaking about the level of the Jews who did actually sin. But all this is not clearly stated. So, as I said, I don't have it 100% clear. We're working our way through it. I'm happy if anybody wants to weigh in and try to understand it. But that's why I keep going back to the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek and back here to try to see how they develop this. But it seems clearly that there are these two, there's no question there's two levels here. And even from the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, you also start seeing it, especially at the end of the Maimer, I started looking. There's the two levels as well. So it sounds like it's the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim of Tzadikim and Yud Gimel Midas Harachim of Abal Tshuva. That's what it sounds like in the parentheses here. But again, I'm happy to hear from anybody else, but I try to make it as clear as I could now, and we'll continue working our way through it. So I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything.
It sounds to me like, first of all, we're talking about a mechanism or mechanisms of tshuva, and it sounds to me like there's one level of Yud Gimel Midas Harachim, whereas let's say you're not doing tshuva, but the Eibishter is he's so kind that he forgives us. I don't know. Maybe there's different levels of tshuva. That's a different issue as well. How deeply are you going for forgiveness? Like there's one thing to be sorry, regret what you're going to do. I don't know, but maybe you're not really doing from the very depths of your heart. You haven't hit rock bottom, as you say, and that's just sort of God's standard level of rachamim and forgiveness. But when you really dig deep, let's say you really hit rock bottom, that's when you hit this higher level of Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. You hit this Tagbaras Ha'atzmius, and that's where it's not just the second level of sweetening, but it's the deepest level, the third level. And what I find, if I'm right
correct.
about
what you just said, what you just said is correct. It's more or less what I said before.
Yeah,
it's accurate. That's correct. That's essentially what he's saying here. The thing is, before he uses expression, the first level he says before he got angry. So it is a type of compassion that essentially like a father has compassion for his children, and even if they do something wrong, he'll overlook it because it doesn't matter. And then there's a level where they really did something that really angered the father, And then they need to, like the rock bottom, and they need to dig deeper and evoke the tzur, the nikra satzur.
Right.
That's the deeper takbetas that comes after anger. That's most likely what he's saying here. Correct. So,
and what I just wanted to comment, just if I could, just for a second, what's really beautiful about this. I mean, if you really think about this deeply, this is an amazing way the Eibishter created the world, which is it's davka when we blow it the most, when we really mess up. He's actually built into the fabric of the way he built the world the capacity to recover from that. Mamish, when you anger him the most, you're actually opening up the very potential you need to be forgiven for it. It's incredible. In other words, of course we don't want to blow it, but when we really blow it bad, the very way he's built
I don't know if you remember, you were as excited like you are now when we read it the first time a few pages back, when we talked about the Gevuros Nimtakim Misharsham, the third level of transformation, that in the darkest of dark below is embedded, like when I spoke about, remember the psychological hypothermia, that within the darkest of the dark below lies the Helam Ha'atzmi. But correct. So no, I'm not minimizing or diminishing your excitement about it. I'm just saying that this is correct, what you're saying, and that is the key point. That is correct.
Very good. It's so beautiful. It's amazing.
The Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim are located in the Nikras Tzur, right? Which is the Helam, the Makom Iti, the hollowed out space of the Tzur, rather than the Tzur itself, because the Tzur itself is not Helam. Tzur is a Yesh itself. It would seem to be, with Solar Alamim is something that is an expression, is a Giloy, rather than a Helam, which would be I would think it would be Nikras. Is that not correct?
Well, he says Tzur is the level of Gvura of Atik, Utsina de Kardenissa. That's what makes it a Tzur. The Nikras Tzur is the Gvuras within it. Like we spoke about this, what exactly is the difference between the rock and the crevice within the rock?
Right.
So you could interpret it two ways. You could say that they're both together the same level, or you could say that Tzur itself is Atik, and the Gevuros of Atik is the crevice within it. But he doesn't make it clear 100%. Later, but earlier, he speaks also about the clay Reikon. The Nikras Tzur could also be the bittel, the Helam within the rock. Remember, the rock itself is a state of concealment because it's like a flintstone. You don't see any, he said clearly, it's a state of potential. It's not actual fire. But it's the root of everything. It's like and the Nikras Tzur sounds like the bittel that you need, the state of concealment within there. So it could be that Tzur is the level itself, and the Nikras Tzur is the focus on the Helam within it. That's what it sounds like when you read it a few times. Regardless, he says from there comes the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim. It's not the Yud Gimel, because remember, that's Gevuros the Atik. It still has to go through Moiches Tema in order to become the Yud Gimel Tikkun Dikna through the Cyrus. So you actually have 3 steps to get to Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim: the Tzur, the Nikras Tzur, and the Tzur and the Nikras Tzur, the Moiches Tema, and then the Cyrus, Moisrei Moichin, like the wires, the thin wires that bring the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim. So it's very likely Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim level 1 would be that's going through the Cyrus, and level 2 is how it's rooted all the way in the Nikras Tzur. Because you could ask the question like this: why didn't God just reveal to him the 13 levels of compassion without putting him on the rock? There's also Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim could be revealed without that, but it would not be the higher level. It had to come from something from the negative. Anyway, I want to read it a few times more to really internalize it, but that's more or less the way the picture is emerging here. But there's a few words that still bother me, to be honest, because he says on top of the page, isn't Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim also comes to forgive sins? And he brings a proof. Shehivir Zami Mehem, that he removed the anger from them and his forgiveness. And what's his answer? that's only removing, but not transferring from within. So even the first level is also coming to forgive. So, but tzaddikim don't have sins. So what are we being forgiven over? Does he mean to say forgiveness to a tzaddik because he hasn't reached the highest level yet? In other words, the tshuva is not on an actual sin, but more like that he can go more. Is that what he's trying to say? He doesn't say it explicitly. So then you have to say that maybe in tshuva itself, even on sins, there's also, like I just said with the father, I think I like that example, that there's the father who just simply loves his children, has so much compassion for them, that anything they do wrong, he overlooks. Not because the like you said, it's einatefus makim nimchakim amavenus. It's like his intensity and his love for them is so powerful that he doesn't get angry. But then there's another level where he did get angry on that level. And then there's the greater strength that comes from that. That is the higher level of tshuva. That's more likely. It's probably two levels in tshuva itself. And something similar is the difference in tzaddikim and bal. Yeah, that's what I think. Because he says, in the parentheses, he says, tzaddikim tshuva ma'ava. But then he says that also by a nefesh alakis is tshuva ma'ava. So I would say that even though he doesn't spell it out, there's probably one level would be that tzaddikim are their tshuva they're doing. That's the first level. Another that even by regular person, it could also be a lower level of tshuva in the sense. Well, lower level. It could be it's invoking more the great love and the great rachmim pshutim, as opposed to something coming from a very dark place, like we just discussed before. That's most likely what he's saying here.
Rabbi Jacobson, as far as a tzaddik, can it be viewed as the two levels? That on a personal level, as you said, tzaddikim don't sin, but they're still part of the Kalal Israel, and they're still part of the Am. So therefore, if we don't have a Beit Hamikdash, they always say if the Beit Hamikdash is not built in your time, it's as if it was destroyed in your time. So at that level, there also is part of us as a Kalal. But as far as the personal level, it's one thing, but they're still part of Am Israel.
Well, he actually said this earlier. He actually said it earlier when the Arizal would say al chet. Why the Arizal said al chet? So he said because it's for the generation, not just for himself personally. It's connected to the generation. I remember somewhere that was brought earlier. I forgot where. But yeah, it's connected to that. You can connect it to that. Okay. Okay, let's stop here. So we're in the middle of the beginning, first third of the page, 1339. Anybody else want to ask anything? Any other comments?
I just wanted to ask in relation to Eliezer's question, if the Tzur is the Rishimu and the Nikras Tzur is the Or, Helema or the Avir, the Yud.
No, one second. Who said that the Nikras Tzur is the Helema or the Avir? One second. Where'd you get that from?
No, I'm looking at where we studied that Butsina de Cardenisa, and Hine, this is the top of page 1330. The Hine Avir who or Yud the Hine or Hakolo Ba'avir, Shazah or Hakolo Ba'Reshimu.
That's not what we're talking about. But that's not what we're discussing. We're talking about the Helam of the Etzem Nekudas HaReshimu, not the that's encompassed in it.
Right, but there is hidden in the Rishimu, there is, I thought we talked about the Yud, which is this.
There is, but what does that have to do with Nikras Tzur?
Well, we were trying, Eliezer asked to distinguish what's the difference from one from the other. If the Tzur is the Butsina de Cardenisa, it's the Gvur Atik, it's Helam. We said it's the Rishimu.
Are you suggesting that is the Ur Kol? I would say probably not.
That's all I was saying. That's all
I would say I don't think that's the meaning.
Okay.
And he definitely doesn't say it. Can you imply that? I would probably say no, because he's talking here about the helam, the core helam of the Rishimu, not the oyer within the Rishimu. That's what I would say.
Because it seems like there's a revitalizing energy, which is the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim.
But Yud
I don't
Gimel
know.
Sarachim is not the Rishimu. It comes from there.
Yeah.
The
I
Rishimu
get it.
itself is the intensity of Gvura Tagberis Ha'atzmus, that is the intensity of concealment, not the intensity of revelation.
That's my point. You're making my point for me. The
So there's no
Tzur
revelation, but there's no reference to Oyer within the Rishimu in the context of Nikras Tzur. That's what I'm saying.
Okay,
It's
I
only the
thought I just-
opposite. It's only, if you go back there, the Rishimu has two things: it has Oyer hidden within it, and it
Right.
has Helam Atzmi hidden, and Tzur is the Helam Atzmi part. I don't see anywhere. So there's no Oyer. He's not referring to Oyer in the Rishimu in the context of Nikras Tzur, is what I'm saying to you. At least not in my reading.
I'll go through it again. I thought I was trying to say that the Nikras Tzur is the place from within the Tzur where you have a Gilui, where you have a
So I
revelation.
just said to you, I would say no. I'm disagreeing.
Uh,
I'm saying, based on my reading of this, it sounds not like that.
Okay, I hear you. I'm going to go read it again.
If your refrigerator is not cooling properly, please make sure that the temperature setting is adjusted to optimal settings for the product.
Especially if to read on top of page 1334. That's where he first lays it out. And there, the question is whether you could read it into there that way. I thought about this, but I read it many times. It doesn't sound like that's what he wants to say. But
Okay.
maybe read it again. Look on the top of 1334, especially.
Okay, I will. Thank you. I appreciate you being very medactic. I'm rushing. I want to get the punchline, but I respect that you're tittering over every word, and that's the right way to study.
Okay, so we'll stop here. We're stopping on top of page 1339. Let's stop.